Scott Hayes was just going to the back of the room trying to persuade some people to fill the empty seats in the front. So if some of you wouldn't mind moving down so he doesn't feel so isolated, that would be really nice. You can do it. Please. That means you, yes, in the back rows. Thank you. Okay. My introduction will not be belabored, but it will be, I think, informative. Scott Hayes is a visiting scholar in the school, and for those of you who don't know that designation, every year there's usually somebody here who's working on a book, doing research, teaches or practices in another country, who is spending time at UVA interacting with faculty and students, working in the library. And Scott is here not only because of the Landscape Architecture Department and the Center for Cultural Landscapes, but also because of the Kluge-Ruhe Museum, one of UVA's museums, which has the largest collection of Aboriginal art in the world outside of Australia. And that is extraordinary 20th century Aboriginal art. So for those of you who somehow think that's folk art, I encourage you to go to Kluge-Ruhe out on Pantops, and you will see some of the most extraordinary contemporary art that's being made in the world. So Scott has been here since August, and he's an expert on indigenous ways of knowing landscape. He is going to give a talk that he gave through the center's roundtables. And the only other thing I want to say about his work that we didn't know at the time he presented before is he's part of a big research consortium that recently won Australian Institute of Landscape Architecture National Award for a fascinating project called Recasting Terra Nullius Blindness, Empowering Indigenous Protocols and Knowledge, an Australian university-built environmental education. And it's a field guide and a series of teaching tools for incorporating Indigenous knowledge across the pedagogy from elementary school on up. And so here's something that a group of academics, both designers, planners, anthropologists, and geographers have been working on to translate their research into public knowledge, which I think is something that many of us in the school are interested in doing. So in the time you have after today's lecture, if you're interested in that, please reach out to Scott. He's happy to have coffee with students and faculty, lunch, go for a walk, maybe go to Kluge-Ruhe. So in the spirit of introducing you to Scott and also encouraging you to spend some time with him over the next 5 or 6 weeks, join me in welcoming Scott Hayes.
Greetings, everyone. Can you hear me okay back there? Yeah. Let me just take away the sound of Fiji for you for a second, just to get everyone in the mood. Okay. There we go. I bet that's the first time we've ever done an introduction with Fijian singing in the background.
No, it's nice.
So welcome and thank you for giving up your evening to listen to me present on one part of the Antipodes, Fiji. But before I get going, I wanted to acknowledge that we meet here today on the lands of the Monacan people. It's very important in our practice, at least in the Southern Hemisphere, to acknowledge that we are meeting here on Indigenous lands. Today, of course, I'm going to be speaking about an Indigenous homeland, Fiji, Viti in Fijian. So I also want to pay my respects to Fijian elders who've contributed to the content that I'm going to present on today. I want to extend my acknowledgements and respect to any Indigenous students or staff that are here today as well, whether they're from America or elsewhere, so welcome. So you see the title of my talk here, landscapes of the gods. I'm not talking here about Christian gods. I'm going to be presenting on a place that I've come to know quite well through visits to a very small place in Fiji. So bear with me over the next 40 minutes as I take you through a walking journey, if you like, through this landscape, a cultural landscape. Whether or not that term actually fits this landscape, we can discuss a little bit later, perhaps in Q&A. It's certainly an indigenous landscape. So how many people here have been to Fiji before? One. So where did you go to Fiji? There, so you know a few of the places. No one else here? Well, there you go. I bet you have your brochure on the front of your desk when you're thinking about what you want to do in your spare time. It looks like paradise. I'm not going to use that word because I don't want to make this seem like an exotic landscape. I guess I'm going to break down your notions of Fiji from an Indigenous perspective. I'm a non-Indigenous scholar. As Beth mentioned in the introduction, I've been working with Indigenous peoples now for 20 years. Firstly, in the Canadian Arctic, of all places for an Australian to be. I did my PhD work in northern Quebec. The homeland there is called Nunavik. Anyone heard of Nunavik before? Yeah? Okay, it's not really that far away from here as the crow flies. And then I've also done a lot of teaching and research with Aboriginal communities in Australia and more recently in Fiji. So, and keeping with the acknowledgements, which is a very important part of practice, especially working with Aboriginal communities, I want to acknowledge my host here at the UVA, Beth and Brad, in the Landscape Architecture program, the Architecture School. The Dean's been great too. And also in anthropology, Jim Igo, the professor here of anthropology in the second row, he's become a great friend. We've hung out a lot and we share a lot of the same interests. So I want to thank the UVA community for having me here. So I've been here now for 2.5 months. So without further ado, let's get into some of the slides here. Got it? So in Fijian, it's Nisa Bula Vinaka. Has anyone heard of bula before? I actually think because we've got such an intimate group here, we should all try to say bula. So the B is like a mba. So we'll go 1, 2, 3, all right? 1, 2, 3, bula. A little bit louder, okay? Because in the Fijian, way is from the belly. So it's 1, 2, 3, bula. There we go. Yeah. So bula means hello, but it's more than a hello. It's it expresses love and kindness. So it's the nisa bit at the front is a very formal way of saying it. So if you're meeting a chief, an elder, you would say nisa, and vinaka means thank you. So this landscape you see in front of you here represents one of the islands within the Fijian archipelago. You may not be aware of this, but there's 360 islands in Fiji. The main one that you would see on TV, like what's that show, Survivor and so forth, it's done up here in the Yasawa groups. This is all the sandy coves. Blue Lagoon was filmed in the Yasawas, so Fiji has got that sort of history. The main island, Vitulevu, here. Viti just means Fiji, yeah. This is where the hub is, if you like, of international trade and comings and goings. So Nandi is where the international airport is located. That's mainly an Indo-Fijian community. And Suva is the international hub where the big banks are, shipping agencies, UN, World Health Organization. And the place I'm going to be speaking about today is here, Vuna, which is on the island called Tabiuni, and in the province of Whakandrove. So the C is a th in Fijian. So just bear with me as I go through the pronunciations. So let's have a look. Vuna. Okay, Vuna is a very small pinprick on the map, if you like, but it's a very important place in Fiji's history. The word Vuna means the root of a plant. And by extension, it took on this term to represent this village. The first village ever in Fiji is said to be here, Vuna. So where the people landed, their feet touched the shore. So some conjecture about that, but the Vuna people certainly say they were the first. And modern-day Fijians archaeologists will tell us, have been there for a couple of thousand years. The Fijians say that they've always been there, but before that, archaeologists tell us there was another group called the Lapita who came to the Fijian archipelago and then disappeared. And we know very little about their belief systems, even skeletal remains. There's only been one skeleton found of the Lapita. So it's a really mysterious group. Lapita were in this area as well. So I want to talk about Vuna because of its prominence in Fiji's history and culture. Because it was the first village, it is said that it was placed there from the gods. So it's more than just a regular village. There's nearly 2,000 villages in Fiji, and this one represents the seat of power for one of the major chiefdoms. Today, it's made up into 15 provinces, a bit like states in the US, if you like. But that's only really used for electoral purposes. Sense of identity is not around the provinces. So this is Vuna village, just taken about a year or so ago when I was last there. It's a very small place. It's right against what's called Vuna Lagoon. And off the edge of this lagoon, you can see in the distance there, drops off to the continental shelf. So you'll see whales passing through here, the big pelagic fish. There's a huge tuna fishing industry, a cannery not far away. Vuna Reef is known as one of the 10 best diving spots in the world. So it attracts quite a few tourists. But tourists never really venture into the village, and I'll go into explain why. In this talk, I'm going to explain some of the dimensions of what it's like to work in a Fijian village as an outsider, some of the caveats, and why it's very important to know the ethics and protocols, not just in the Fijian context, but in other Indigenous contexts. So this will serve as a good case study. So that was the picture before of only a year ago, but back in 2016, Vuna Village was annihilated by a Category 5 cyclone. It struck at 12 noon. It brought a tsunami and a storm surge, and the only thing left sitting in place in the village was a toilet cistern. That was the only thing. Everything was completely gone. It was a pretty major event. They say that Winston was the most damaging cyclone that's ever existed in the South Pacific. They say they were lucky there was no loss of life because it happened in the daytime. So I just want everyone to know that these are tough communities that we're talking about here, and they've rebuilt in the last 3 years. So I managed to get a chance to go over there after that. I'll come back to that after. So a little bit of history here. The island Taveuni used to be called Vuna Island, and the early explorers changed the name to Taveuni, but the entire island itself was part of this Vuna chiefdom. It's known as the Garden Island in English. It's really impressive and it's quite mountainous, one of the most mountainous islands in Fiji. 87% of the lands in Fiji are Indigenous owned. So there's an extraordinary amount of land that sits in Indigenous hands. Compare that to Australia, where it's only a few percent of the land in Indigenous hands. I don't know what the percentage here is in the US, but I'm sure it's nowhere near that, perhaps in the 5 or 10% or somewhere thereabouts. The other thing about Vuna is that it attracted pastoralists very early on in the colonial days. The soils there, because it's volcanic activity, they're very rich, and these pastoralists from Australia set up shop. They married into the local Vuna families, and with the sale of a few guns and other small effects as trade, they took up enormous swaths of land and built the biggest coconut plantations in the southern hemisphere. So when you put virgin oil, coconut oil onto your skin or some sort of cream, it's probably come from this island. Yep. So although there's 87% of Fiji's in indigenous hands on the island of Taveuni, a fair chunk of it is actually freehold land. So the Vuna homeland has been consumed by pastoral land take-up, if you like. So let's talk a little bit about an outsider coming into a village. Given only one person in this room has gone to Fiji, or to the, I think you went to Tonga as well, so you know a little bit about this. You see on the brochures in Fiji, beautiful, island cays, and you're going to sit out there in your bikinis and drink champagne and whatever else. It isn't like that for most of Fiji. In fact, that happens away from the villages. Fiji is a very conservative place. The way you hold yourself, the way you dress is very well considered. So when you go into a village, you have to take care for how you look. You can't wear a hat because wearing a hat is higher than, suggesting that you have a higher status than the chief. And in the olden days, you were speared and eaten. So, but these things live on today. Other things are women coming into the village have to wear skirts down below their knees. Men have to wear T-shirts that are not too short and so forth. So there's some respect there that needs to be observed. So the village name is, the word for village is koro. And entering this, like I said, is not just a straightforward enterprise where you roll up off of a plane, you hop in a little four-wheel drive, go down a dusty road and say, here, I'm going to have a look around and take photos. It's really not allowed. You wouldn't like it if someone did that if they came into your house. But you believe me, there's people who try. So some of the protocols that exist in Fiji about entering a village come from the warrior days of feuds, because if you did that, then you'd be suggesting you wanted to undertake a coup and take over the village. So there is a formal ceremony that's involved with entering the village for the very first time. Doesn't matter whether you're a Fijian or not. If you're not from this village, you have to undergo this ceremony called a sevusevu. The diagram you see here in front of you is indicative of a chief's bureau. So the bureau is the Fijian word for house, and the chief is the person in the village who has the highest status and the person you must speak to. So you're brought into the village by a person called the koro, which means the village headman. And on doing so, you always observe what the koro is doing. This sevusevu ceremony occurs in Fijian, and you keep your head low down in deference to the chief, and you're put in a particular place in the bureau when you arrive. This is a very old ceremony. It still goes on today, but it's an induction, if you like. You're here to greet the chief. The koro is going to explain to the chief your purpose of being there, and in this conversation, as an outsider, you sit there and you say nothing, because you've got to hope that koro is an advocate for you and your reason for being there. So the first time I ever went to Vuna village, I was in a sevusevu ceremony. I had no idea. I must admit I was quite naive, but I knew as we hopped off the back of the truck to walk down to the chief's bureau that something was going on here that was quite serious. You actually have to pay a lot of attention. It's a little bit nerve-wracking because you're in someone's home, you've got someone of very high status, and it's all happening in a language that you don't know. Anyway, so this induction also involves a way of protecting the chief, because you never would really know who's coming into the village and their purpose. So the chief here, you can see where he's positioned. Now, see this little button here. This here is called a Talanoa. Talanoa is the bowl that's used to mix up kava, which is from a pepper plant. It's like when you drink this, you feel quite relaxed. It's probably the same effect as beer mixed with marijuana, that sort of effect. But it's also medicinal, and it's an important spiritual drink. So in the sevusevu exchange, the Tarangan and Koras explain the purpose for you being there. The chief will then acknowledge that, and he'll say a few words, and then he will speak to you in English and say, what's the purpose of you being here? And you say in very brief terms, I'm here as a visitor, as a friend of, or I'm interested in doing some work with you guys. Do you give me permission to do that? And generally, the chief will say that's completely fine, and once the sevusevu is over, you now have access to that village forever. It is the key to the village. It is the gateway. So if I've gone to this village many times, I still do a sevusevu each time out of respect. I don't have to. But if someone was to see me walking around the village, no one can say, hey, what are you doing? Because the chief has already made the arrangement. This is an oral society. There's a number of witnesses in the sevusevu circle who will go around and explain, before you've even ducked out of the building, the purpose of your visit. And the chief can set rules. He can say, look, you can come and go and you can fish or not fish, or I allow you to walk into people's homes without knocking, that sort of thing. So it's a really serious ceremony. And you don't see this in the tourist brochures when you go to Fiji. Yeah, so it's very conservative. Now, the structure of the bure and the seating arrangement is also manifest in the landscape itself and in the architecture. There's a hierarchy of space that's occurring here. So the chief is seated up, away from everyone else. The Talanoa, the kava bowl, sort of forms a level of protection, if you like. That's the mediator. The drink is the mediator. And then his heralds, guardians, if you like, sit around him. So when you're ushered into this space, you're sort of put there, and another person's put there, and you have no idea where you're going to end up. But as a professor, the chief will regard you as what's known as a ratu. A ratu is the same title given to a chief. So if you're afforded that status, you'll be positioned right next to the chief. Okay, so this one is representative. It's not a Vuna, but the same applies. This is looking inside at the bureau. It's designed in a way, the village, where all the bureaus largely look the same and have a similar orientation. The centrepiece of the village is what's called a rara, and I'll show a slide in a minute what that is. That's a village green. And wherever you are around that village green, you can look down there and get this beautiful vista of that green space. But again, there's certain orientations that are being observed. Seating in the traditional building, there would be a king pole right here in the centre, and you would never be allowed to place your feet towards that pole because the pole represents the chief. So you have to have your head towards that space. Here's an indicative drawing of all the villages across Fiji. So all 2,000 of them have a rara, a village green, the centrepiece. And there's ways you have to observe as you enter these people's houses, or which door you take. There's 3 doors. You have to know. There's no sign that says you enter this door. You have to know which one is for guests, which one is for meal times, which one is exclusively for the chief himself or herself. So from a design perspective, this is pretty remarkable that this system has been going and is intact, has remained intact even since Christianity took hold, 120 years ago. So, sevusevu, you've been into the chief's place, you've now been escorted out of the village, and you have a chance to meet people. So it's more than just shaking hands and saying, I'm Scott, I live in Australia, how are you? There's another formal process called Talanoa. Talanoa can be translated to be storytelling or exchange of pleasantries. But it is more than that. Again, these terms don't neatly have an English equivalent. Is it not working? Yeah. Uh-huh. Okay. I don't know why it's not working there. Yeah. So the Talanoa is designed to build trust. So again, you're not coming into this place as an outsider and only sharing a little bit about it and then trying to gather information from them. You actually have to give a bit to get a bit. That's what Talanoa is. So it's formalised. The Talanoa, of course, was occurring around the sevusevu ceremony, but it happens everywhere you go. And that means you have to invest time with people. Proper time means invest in explaining whether you're married or not, whether you have children. You don't have children, why don't you have children? If you're a young woman and you're like in the 30s, how come you certainly don't have children? There's a little bit of judgment too. But it's designed to make sure that you are part of that village. Because once the chief has said it's okay for you to be in the village, you actually become embedded in the village. And that embeddedness can be discussed around a term called Vuna. Vuna means land, but it also means homeland. It means the spirit of place. It means the animals around you, the sea, the gardens, the sky, and everything else in between. So after the sevusevu, you've been introduced. It's now your village. You carry that Vuna. So you have a responsibility to that place. So all these things are happening as a newcomer here. It's quite exhausting, but it's a very important part of building up that relationship. And when you greet people for the first time, you often take a gift. Here you can see it on the left-hand side of that slide. This is kava that's dried. It's grown in the village, in and around the village. It takes about 4 years for this to grow. It's a highly prized plant, sold all around the world. And you would take a bundle of this with you and give as a gift to each household that you go to. And someone would pound it up and you would drink kava. So at the end of the day, if you visit 10 houses, you've had a lot of kava. Yeah. So the kava drinking, just for fun, is out of a coconut shell. And as normally I'm the person there holding the ratu title, if you like, I would take the first cup. You must drink from the first cup even if you don't like the smell or it looks muddy or didn't like the saliva from someone else having it. So you take it down in one go. You're not allowed to spill it because that looks silly. There's an art form to drink in kava. And then it goes around the group. And when it comes around the second time, you can deny it. You can say, nicely, I've had my bit. Or you can say high tide or low tide. That represent how much you want in the bowl. Or no tide. Yeah. So, now this concept of Talanoa, although I've worked a lot with elders, remember the village is made up of children and elders too. It's a very vibrant place. You can go anywhere in the village. You have complete freedom after the sevusevu. And each trip I always invest time going to the local school. And here we are doing the Talanoa at the Vuna school. This is the makeshift school after it had been demolished from Cyclone Winston. Children are really happy. It's about 100 degrees Fahrenheit out there, 90 degrees humidity. But they just love visitors and they love to hear what's going on. So it's important as a researcher to actually get to know all the community, not just those you think you're going to be working with. Often it's the children of the families that you're working with that are here in these spaces. So again, we go to the kindergarten. So I spoke before about some of the hierarchy that occurs in a Fijian village. And this is right across Fiji. The concept you see in front of you here is how society is arranged. So the chief is in the centre, but around that are various skill sets which underpin the chief. It's basically for the smooth operation of the village. This is a very old way of structuring the village and is still in place today. So we see the herald who would be seated around the chief at any official events. The heralds are also the chief makers. When a new chief is installed, it's the heralds that deliberate to determine who the new chief will be. And the heralds are watching those who are born into the chiefly line from a very young age and looking at the character of the people, men or women, to see whether they have the trappings of a chief in years to come. So it's a very important role. The priests. In the olden times, these will be what's called the oracle priests, those who understand the medicines, the spirit landscape, and can talk to the other worlds. A lot of the priests today who are born into this line are now Christian priests. Interestingly, warriors, there are two types of warriors in Fijian village. There's the inside warrior and then the outside warrior. One's to protect the chief near his bureau, and the other warriors are positioned outside the village to protect them from any attack. It doesn't happen anymore, but this was in place a long time ago, remember. Carpenters are the craftspeople. They know how to build the bureaus, they know how to build anything you want to build. It's in their mind, in their head. It's been passed on genetically from one generation to the next. That's what they say. All these skill sets. How to fish. When you're born, you already know how to catch tuna. You already know how to sew a net. Warriors, when they come out as babies, they say they've already got six packs and they're already strong enough to withstand a fight. But that structure is very important to understanding how a village is underpinned. Everyone is born into a place. So we spoke before about the Vuna as the homeland. If you're born into the warrior clan, you can't change clans. You are who you are. You always carry that in you. You were the warrior for that Vuna. You were the fisherman for that Vuna. It's probably no accident that the Fijians are the most happiest people in the world. Yeah? From the time they're born, they know who they are. They have land. They're surrounded by a system which keeps it all strong and running on all cylinders. Have a look what we try and do in landscape studios and design studios, trying to figure out complex problems sometimes. We look at landscape systems today, but these systems have been intact for a very long time. They know how to, the fishermen know when to not take too many tuna. They know when it's time to conserve the smaller fish, so not net some of the inside of the lagoon. So they know about conservation. The carpenters know all about the trees. They know when to preserve the older stock for the seed. They know about what part of the plant will produce a really good building and so forth. It's a very rich art forms within each of those fields. They're masters of their domain, so they're born into that. In fact, the Fijians say that upon conception that actually occurs, that information is transmitted. It's a very strong way of being. So I want to talk a little bit about this cultural landscape that's been shown to me. I needed to provide that sort of context to explain the landscape around you. So my first trip to Vuna was in 2014. And I was introduced to Vuna through one of my PhD students, an architect, a Fijian architect. An indigenous Fijian is called iTaukei. He's an iTaukei. He also belongs to the Carpenter clan from his village. And he was aware that in Vuna they wanted to build an interpretive centre to celebrate the cultural landscape, the significant sites of this place. So I accompanied Satoki, who's my student. He's also my friend. Satoki was trained in architecture in Australia. And he said, Scott, there's a really good opportunity here to work with the community, identify the cultural sites with them, and see whether this can underpin a cultural centre, a keeping place. So I went to Fiji for the first time on that basis through Satoki's introduction. And they say when you go to Fiji, you need to have a key. You need a person who's going to give you that key to get into that door. And iTaukei was that person for me, and he's allowed me into this place. Okay. Sometimes it's hard to locate where that key is. And on that first visit, we were thrown into the deep end. We were told that after the sevusevu, the Talanoa, drinking copious amounts of kava, they said, Scott, we really like what you were doing up in Arctic Canada. Can you do similar work here in our village and help us map some of these sites? I had no idea what I was going to see the next day. So I'm going to talk about a walking journey through the landscape and show some of the sites. What they wanted to show me were cave systems. So this is a volcanic landscape. There are a lot of caverns and volcanic looms around the place, but they're really important from a spiritual perspective. There was a lot of black magic performed in some of these caves, but they're also important for warfare, and there's a lot of archaeology in these spaces. And to locate these caves, it wasn't as easy as we're going to get out a map and here we're going to go. There's no maps of these places. The maps are up here. Yeah? They're all cognitive maps. And as I explained before, there's these different knowledge nodes. You have to find the right person in that knowledge node who can take you into that part of the landscape domain. So we go out into the, we have a meeting in the village, we go a little way out to a farm, and then there's some discussion where a farmer comes over and they say, yeah, we'll join the group. So the group grows, you know. They said, we know where these caves are. We remember them from, 10, 20 years ago. We don't go there very often. And so it's machete through the forest to find these, This is the first cave that we came across. And here is one of the local farmers talking about his knowledge of this cave site. So when I embarked on this walk, I didn't have all this U-Butte equipment with me. I didn't have proper microphones. I had, this is back in 2014, so I had a pretty ordinary camera. And we used whatever we had at hand to do recordings along the way. But what I realised is this wasn't about that type of mapping that I thought we would be doing. This is about them bringing me into that cultural landscape. I'm now part of the Vuna A, and they're showing me snippets so I can get a general reading of everything else around. So this traversing through the landscape is the actual mapping itself. The people we encounter, the farmers we meet, the food that we eat along the way that's from the forest, coconuts and so forth, is the cultural mapping. Yeah? It isn't a GIS layer. We are it. And we're telling the story of these sites with the people around us. And I think that's what's quite magical about thinking cultural mapping in this sort of way. It happens in situ, there and then, with what's around you. And you have to be prepared to have those around you to support that journey. Yeah, it's everyone's journey as you do it. You're just a person, you're a vehicle, a passenger in that. So this is one of the caves that we entered. You just imagine, it's really hot. We're up on the side of this hill. It's taken us half a day to get there, and up opens this cavern. And inside, there's pottery this deep of Lapita pottery. These are the people who came before the modern-day Fijians. And it's crunching under our feet. And it's really, archaeologists would be, oh my goodness, don't go in here. And they get in, they're having a smoke, we're walking everywhere, and they're saying, well, we used to play here as kids. And then they open up and they explain the name of the place, and then its connection to other places. So you have to be in this landscape to understand the cultural landscape. You have to go within. Yeah? You have to feel the moisture off that cave to understand what the meaning is of that place. So we learn here that the cannibalism was performed in this cave. One of the farmers told us there used to be a small skeleton there. They thought a young girl had a necklace that was around her skull and all sorts of things. So there's pretty rich sites that we're going to, pretty powerful places. So along the way, I suggested to them, why don't we just do quick 5 minutes on the camera the name of the place, your name, how you got to know it. So we had something to refer back to each time. And that's what we did. We're also learning about the natural history as we're going through. So we've got to be careful to think about cultural landscape just as the static item. Here, this is a dynamic landscape. Taveuni is really well known for an enormous bat called the monkey face bat. The only place found in the world. It's delicious, but I haven't eaten it. But they do. But we're out there with the flashlight, we're looking into these things, and boom, out pops this small bat. It's a micro bat, only about this big. And then a discussion ensues. Tell me all about the names of the parts of the bat, where you find them elsewhere, and they're a delicacy, and so forth. So the cultural landscape is opening up as we pass through, just by happenstance. And that little bat came on the journey with us back in the village in one of the person's pocket. Here we visited an enormous tree. You can see there the girth of it. So we've gone up this mountain. We've trekked actually quite some way. I asked at the beginning of the day, how long do you think, how long a walk, how long? And they said, no, not too far. Should I bring anything? No, we'll be all right. You don't need to bring anything. So I had like a little bottle of water like this, and we walked something like 20 miles by the end of the day, and we ate wild cucumbers, and there's all these young coconuts. It's really great for your tummy, by the way. And that was a real experience, right? We get over this mountain, and then the road says village this way. So I thought, right, we're nearly back at the village. I said, actually, we want to take you this way. We end up doing this other little leg for 5 miles. And through pure stamina, we made it, and we went over onto this pasturous land, and they showed us this tree. And they said, this isn't just a tree. This is where a battle took place between the Tongans and the Vuna warriors, and it was up to the last warriors where the Vuna warrior threw his spear, and it went through the tree and struck the Tongan warrior in the heart, killed him, and that was the end of the battle. So when you're driving along this landscape, and you see this tree from afar, and there's cattle grazing underneath and rubbing up against it, little do you know that it's actually a really important tree to the story of Vuna and a story to the Pacific. Because in those days, Tonga was trying to take over Fiji. So that tree is central to the Fiji and Tongan wars. And it's a glorious landscape. The Vuna village itself, where it is positioned now on the edge of the lagoon, is a small village. It's always roughly been that size, a few hundred people. But all villages in Fiji move, constantly on the move, whether it's to do with natural systems, tsunamis, storm surges, volcanoes. So what you see around the Vuna landscape, the Vuna Vanua, is actually their old villages. And this picture here shows the site of one of the Chief Bureau's foundations called a yavu. And the yavu is a really interesting construct in Fiji. I spoke about this at my last talk. This particular foundation might be 1,000 years old. If you belong to the chiefly line, you're born into the chiefly line, you can actually go back to this place and build a modern day bureau on top of it. So if we think about it in sense of time and scale, the villages might have moved, but there might be a time when this gets repopulated again or becomes someone's holiday cabin on top of their yavu. That's how strong the land is to kin, to people, and place. A deep connection with it. The Fijians always telling me they're walking around barefoot so they can feel what the earth's saying. And interestingly, when a chief is being brought into the world, is earmarked as the chief, that child never has their feet touching the ground, ever. They're so holy that they keep their feet off of the ground. And there's other characteristics about Vuna which are really fascinating, and I'm not sure they're in other parts of Fiji. But because Vuna is said to have come from the gods, at its original place, it has another name attached to the chiefs. Normally it would be Tui Vuna, but there's a su prefix which denotes that it's, yes, they're chiefs, but they also belong to the sky and the earth and everywhere else. They are above normal people. Yeah, they carry that today. So that's what makes this fascinating. We're actually walking through here landscapes, settlement sites which belong to the gods. Yeah? And now cattle roam over this and are grazing. I'm just watching the time here. I want to show you about one really important site that was shown to me. There's been a lot of places that I've seen, but I don't have permission to show slides of some of them. It's really important that we respect what our Indigenous colleagues say when you're working with them. But to become a chief, it isn't a straightforward process. Again, the heralds have been watching you since birth. When the time comes after a chief has died, someone will wake up in the morning and a huge bamboo stake will be in front of their house, and that signals that that person's going to become the next chief. And what follows are an amazing set of initiations. The soon-to-be chief is taken up, in Vuna at least, up into the mountains, not far from these caves that I was taken to. They're all related as part of this story. And they sit there, the heralds and the chief, around this stone site where there's a natural dish on this stone platform. And that's where they drink the kava. The ceremony done here to initiate the chief. So we were taken to the site. It was completely covered with vines, and they had the machetes out. It's only certain clans that can clean and maintain these sites as well. You actually have to have permission. You have to be present with them while you're there. There were farmers nearby who cultivate land only 10, 20 metres away, who watched us come up the path and were a little bit suspicious of what we were doing. And then the Tauranga Koro was explaining he's up here to clean the site. These farmers wouldn't come anywhere near it. They're really highly spiritually charged, and you have to have the permissions to be there. Yeah, you almost can feel it. And this is one of the bowls, so they would be drinking here from this. And that was what it looked like, passage into that particular site. So all around the place, you see these stone formations. Again, these are the yavus. You wouldn't know. You think they just look natural mounds from a distance. Yeah. I mentioned before that a lot of the Vuna Vanua has been taken up through pastoralism. Here we see a really important landmark that was used in the Vuna-Tonga Wars, and we have coconut plantation running right through the middle of it. Wherever you can get that coconut in, it'll grow. So you can see the integrity of some of these spaces are starting to get a little bit damaged. And it does hurt the Vuna people to see this, to show me these sites. Yep. So, I said the chief is the central feature of the village. There's all these initiations and practices. Upon death of the chief, an enormous stone mound is made right up against the village. So there's about 12 of these mounds, 12, 15 of these mounds near the present day Vuna village. In the older villages we looked at in other parts of the surrounds, they're there too. And it would be that all the chief's wives would be buried with the chief. It could be anywhere between like 12 and 20 wives would be buried in that space. These burial mounds, like I said, are right up against the village. Children know not to go and use them as a shortcut to get from one place to another through the village space. So they're highly revered and regarded. Now, I've shown you a lot of pictures of the land and the tunnels and the caves, but really Vuna is a land-based village. Yeah? They're up against the edge of the lagoon for a reason. There's no fresh water in Vuna. In fact, only until recently there's now electricity through solar panels. So the times I've visited there, there's no river to go wash your things in. So where do you go? You go out in the sea. There's these freshwater upwellings that are there. And you see people, washing their clothes and so on. There's enough fresh water coming up from the sea to lather yourself with soap. But you can't just duck into any spot in the sea. It's actually arranged around gender. So the one I'm showing you here is where only men are allowed to swim. This is the view as you look around from the bay, and these pools are tucked in there. This is the women's bathing pool. Yeah. So it would be taboo for men to enter this space. Yeah. The word taboo actually is a Pacific word. We use it today, but it's from these sorts of practices. Yeah, so taboo. And there's one space in between for the children to play, mixed gender. Yeah? So it would be about as spatially a few hundred metres between the men's and women's bathing space. There's a major coastal tract that's near the women's bathing place. As you walk past, you would never cast your eyes out across there. These are all the sort of the unwritten rules. So again, can you imagine if you're a tourist and you've come here and you think, oh, doesn't this look like paradise? There's coconut trees. I just want to go for a dip. What do you think would happen if you went into the wrong swimming pool? Yeah, we know what would have happened in the old days. Again, you would have been eaten. But these are the sorts of things I wanted to bring to your attention when you work in Indigenous homelands. There are these intangible aspects of the landscape, the unseen aspects. You have to have that person who's got that key, who's willing to open those doors for you to show you the way. They don't want you to make faux pas. They want to show that they're great hosts. So you have to be observant of these things. Now, the last pool, so there's 4 pools. Yeah? One for the women, the children to mix, the men. But the last pool is tucked a little bit further away from the village. And this is where the chief is brought down from the mountain and carried and laid into this pool for the final part of the initiation. And the Vuna people have a totem, and it's the shark. Now, Vuna warriors, Vuna chiefs in the past had spoken to the sharks and had an agreement that when the Vuna people are swimming in the water, that the sharks wouldn't attack them. And that the Vuna fisherman clan wouldn't target sharks. It's actually taboo to use the term shark in Vuna. You're not allowed to speak about your totem. But they do that as a newcomer when you learn, right? Now, when this last chief was initiated, only about 2 or 3 years ago, he was brought down here. There was video taken of this initiation. Believe it or not, a shark swam right past. It's the only time when the pact is broken down, when the initiation is not yet complete, the shark and the chief is like open for negotiation again. But they said that as the shark came past, it signalled that the arrangement's still in place. And for everyone else around who witnesses this, it's saying that goes to show that, you know, our elders have told us these stories. They're here for us, you know. We can swim safely in the water. There's another view of this. So I said it's slightly discreetly placed around the corner. Only a couple more slides, and then I'd love to hear some questions from the floor. I show this one for fun. The Vuna people say that this is where surfing was invented, and they said that women were the surfers, not men, and they would surf on coconut fronds. Yeah. And I believe him. There's a really good break there. People have asked me, like surfers in the room, oh, where is it? You know, because they wanted to be on their list, and I'm not telling you. You know. Yeah. So there's another interesting feature of this little cove. It's called tidal rock stone, and they say if you pick up a rock and you cast it and you hit this rock, you can see there. You see the white stone that's about to hit the rock. And so if you hit that rock, it'll cause a wave to come up. There they say, we do that to make sure there's good waves for surfing. But in some of the archaeological literature I've read, it said if a rock was struck there, it would cause a tsunami. So there may be some misinterpretation on behalf of the ethnographer, archaeologist. That's another look at that unusual rock formation right there. There are other elements of this landscape which show how grand it is as a chiefdom. including a giant prison wall, which probably held the Tongan warriors when they captured them. Easily could have put 500 to 1,000 warriors into this. The walls are about 30 metres high. It was amazing being shown this place because there was some discussion about where it exactly was. It's really thick in the forest. And after the cyclone, when I returned here, there was defoliation, right? So you can start to see features, which is a rare thing. You can tell that there were large trees planted inside that fort, which are unlike the trees around. And I wonder whether or not this is so the locals could identify where it was by knowing the different trees. That is the view from the top of the prison, really high up. And then only one or two slides left. So I've been taken out on the land, and the last few trips I've been taken out onto the water. And this particular site you see here is where fresh water comes from the rock. You have to respect this place. You have to be really quiet. So how you approach this rock will determine whether or not the rock will give you water. So you would come here with a pail, and it said that you would catch it. Now, this site is also protected by two white sharks. And they're not real sharks, they're like spirit sharks. They're sharks. And I asked about, I always ask these things, who was the last person to see one, and the names and things, and they gave me the names for them. And they said that some things happened, like an earthquake on Taviuni, and it changed the dynamics, the rock formations, and then the water didn't flow from here anymore. And they say maybe that's why the sharks haven't come back to protect it. But I want to ask more questions about this, and that is the rock formation there. So again, that's what it looks like right below it. If you're going along on your little tinny, you're observing the rock on the side, you would have no idea about these intangible elements of the landscape. I feel like I'm just scratching the surface. Yeah, I've just been shown the window into this space. We've gone through the Talanoa. The trust is there. In fact, one of my friends was on WhatsApp and texted me before the presentation. I hope it goes well. I always ask for permission to speak about these places. It's a very important practice. You must ask for permission. So I just want to wrap up here by my take on this cultural landscape. So as I mentioned at the beginning, for you to become... I'm not an expert on Fijian cultural landscapes. I'm part of the journey of understanding this cultural landscape that we started 4 years ago. The people there have entrusted me with the skills to work with them to map these sites. And I'm not sure what the end product is going to be. It's probably going to be another 5 types of journeys like this where we're out on the reef fishing for tuna and I find out a story about something. Tuna and shark story or something like that. And it's going to take many trips like that before I can get a feeling of how we're going to assemble this knowledge. And my feeling is it's going to be these traverses into the land and the seascape that will make up that broader cultural landscape picture. As opposed to going in with a formulaic way of saying we're going to map it this way with these tools. It's a very iterative process. And it's based on who you're with at the time. It's based on your relationships with the people in that place. The gift-giving, that ongoing Talanoa. So I wanted to share this case study, no matter what design discipline you're in, so that you can think about your work when you embark on doing your drawings or your cultural mapping or analysis and say, is my analysis looking at the geology through a survey map the proper way to analyse this space? Does it give me a proper cultural reading of it? Looking at rainfall and other things like this we can get off other websites. Is that really the place that you're studying? And that's what I've come to learn after 20 years of doing this sort of work, is I don't have the answers, but I think we're heading in the right direction here. It's about you're dealing with sensitive knowledge. You can't publish everything. And you have to be true to the people that you're working with. So I'm going to say hear the Fijian words. Moce, which means good night. Loloma means love and best wishes to you and your family. And vinaka, vakalevu means thank you very much for your time. Yeah. Great. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Hi, thank you, Scott. My name is Ghazal Jafari, and I'm one of the new faculty members at in the Landscape Architecture program.
Yeah.
So I have a comment and a question. First of all, thank you so much for this honest presentation, and I think your presentation clarified a lot of misunderstandings and questions for students and faculties alike when it comes to the questions regarding working with indigenous people through non-colonial relation building, right? And I would like to really admire kind of your note on maps, the absence of visual maps, as opposed to kind of these sensorial maps that require your presence in the place, and the fact that it kind of clarified as well that your presence in the place doesn't necessarily mean that you've got the embodied knowledge, right? That is a completely different story, and I think clarifying that difference, the difference between the field research and the embodied indigenous knowledge is really important. But also that puts into question kind of the extent of credibility of Western educational systems and particularly institutional educational systems when these particular types of credentials have so much value as opposed to understanding that people who are experts in this particular type of knowledge are not educated in universities and they're coming from a completely different angle, right? So that expands all of a sudden, all of a sudden who's considered as expert and who's not. So thank you.
Yeah.
Through your presentation, I picked up that Fiji indigenous populations have been lucky enough to be able to kind of continue practicing some of their sustainable, time-tested land relations, right? But I'm wondering how they're reacting to kind of pressures that are put by climate change and sort of the larger kind of disturbance, ecological disturbance of the entire ocean, right? Because it's one ocean, everything is connected, and other indigenous populations of Pacific islands have not been so lucky, right? It's like Bikini Atoll, Hawaii, all the way to New Zealand. So I'm wondering whether there are any conversations in the community regarding indigenous resurgence, environmental resurgence, particularly after the 1990s kind of UN UNDRIP and recognition of indigenous rights. Thank you.
Yeah, so the Fijians are certainly engaged in world affairs. Everyone's got access to the internet through Facebook and so on. So there's some really strong networks from indigenous to indigenous in other parts of the Pacific and the world. At the local scale, the management of that landscape system takes place through those dynamics I explained in that circle. Everyone has a role. Of course, there's agronomists that come in from the government who are monitoring soil conditions. There are scientists looking at the reefs. But by and large, it comes down to local action, to looking after these spaces. So I mentioned that the fisherman's role is to know when to cut back on harvesting certain types of fish. The rivers are really well looked after, for instance. But the Fijians know the bigger problem. And to give you an example, so nearby island, Tuvalu and the Kiribati are being hit pretty hard, yeah? So with storm surges and high tides, they've lost a lot of land. It's very close to Fiji. The Fijians have opened their arms and embraced them and actually set about opening up parts of Suva, main streets of Suva and several side streets for those people and said, this is now your Vuna. So you can go into Suva and you can see Kiribati shops from Tuvalu as well. To say that, look, if other countries aren't going to do something to help out, we will. Because their local neighbours, if you like. So they're showing it at different levels, you know. And I think it's a really great gesture and for the Fijians to have done that, to open their arms for their neighbours. Yeah.
Thanks for a great lecture. You may not be far along in the study to answer this question, but I'm very interested in what the impact of Christianity may have been on this indigenous religion, because when you showed a village plan, it looked like there was a church there with a cross on it.
Yeah.
So I don't know how these two spiritual traditions have interacted.
Yeah. It's a good question. Christianity nested pretty easily on top of Fijian traditional society. We saw the cross of the church is where the oracle priest's bureau would have been. It was a really large bureau, really large room. Yeah. So that just took its place. The highest seat in the village is where the church is going to be. Inside just about every Fijian home, there's a picture of the Last Supper. Yeah. Not all Fijians are Christians, but many are. And it's warmly embraced. They are Fijians. There's some quite reticent to talk about some of the spiritual stuff that I addressed here in this conversation. But also the way in which the heralds and the chief, a little bit like the apostles, it all sort of sits in a hierarchical form that could easily be mapped upon it. And the missionaries wrote about this. And that's why there was a very quick uptake in that part of the world. Yeah. So that's why I mentioned a lot of the traditional priests are now the priests in the modern Christian church. Yeah.
Thanks, Scott. I enjoyed your presentation. I wanted to ask a couple more proximate related questions. So I know, like, often when we think about working in indigenous landscapes, we think about them being far from us, being somewhere else. And that's the sort of mindset that we have. So I'm interested in, what you started out with, thinking about the proximate responsibility to the place where you are. So like here at UVA,
Yep.
right? In relation to the indigenous landscape here, right? And I would think about that in relation to everyday life, but also like mapping projects like this that are proximate. And I'm interested in also the distinctions you might draw between cultural and indigenous landscapes in thinking about that.
Yeah. One of the first exercises I did when I came here to the UVA was to be better informed about the Monacan Nation and the UVA's presence on the Monacan Nation. And it's disheartening to read about things that have gone on. And through Jim and others, I've been able to at least get a bit of a sense of what some other Indian Nation groups are doing in the Virginia state, in the Commonwealth. So I carry those sensibilities from the places that I've been. And yes, it doesn't matter whether it's urban or remote. These sorts of places that I've just described, there'll be things like that around here. Yeah? We just have to find the person with the key who's willing to let us into those spaces. I really think that, and I know the Monacan stories and the histories here and how that's difficult, but I don't think we should stop trying to build those partnerships to get a better sense of the indigenous landscape around us. It's really hard. You come into Charlottesville or any other urban setting, sometimes there's no signs that there is an indigenous landscape, but you're walking on top of it.
How would you distinguish it? You talked earlier about indigenous landscapes.
Oh yeah, indigenous. That's something I've been thinking about more recently, probably the last 6 months actually. Because I keep feeling when I read the literature on cultural landscapes, it seems to have a cultural, a colonial sense about it. I use the term cultural landscapes in this presentation and to describe other indigenous landscapes because that's what people are familiar with. There's guidelines in the UN that use these things through UNESCO, but I actually think there's another category out there altogether. Indigenous landscapes is good, but the other thing about that is it may suggest that there are non-Indigenous, not non-native, that Indigenous spaces, and then there's spaces that are not Indigenous. But I think the entire landscape realm is indigenous, depending on whose homeland you're on. But I think we need to keep figuring out that terminology and get it right. So I think what we'll see in the next 5 to 10 years is the term cultural landscape fade out, and then there'll be something like indigenous landscapes come in to distinguish between the two. So if you talk about what I've experienced visiting Charlottesville, I'm still a novice. The Blue Ridge is a cultural landscape. The wineries and so forth. I wouldn't say that the landscapes I just described here are in the same sort of league, if you like. I was lucky with Jim and some of the other anthropology staff and students to go on a river kayak on the Nottawa River a few weeks ago, where one of the Nottawa tribal people there, she took us on the river, explained the importance of the cypress trees was down at that level, we're in place. And then she was singing some of the songs of the river as we were going along, so it was being enacted. Is that a cultural landscape? That's happening there and then in that moment. So I think the terms are useful for certain things, but I'm not sure it's one size fits all for that. It's a good point. Yeah.
Thank you for the lecture and generally being available for all of us to ask questions all the time. I was wondering, I noticed when you were going on the walking tour that a lot of the people pictured were men, and I was wondering how the personal topographies and spatial knowledge and then the significance given to places is different for the women in this community, and if it's similar locations, different ways of being introduced to it and different significances.
Yeah, that's a really important question. I guess I've only seen one element of the landscape. Yeah? Fiji is a patrilineal society by and large, so that means it's passed through information is generally passed through the male line or some of the roles and responsibilities. But I'm completely aware that there's a completely different landscape that I will never get to see. One of my other students, she's iTaukei, an architect about the same age. She's really interested in this stuff. She's come with me to Vuna. She has familial ties there. And so she goes off and speaks to the women about it, and then she'll come back and we talk about this, and then I realise I'm just seeing one aspect of it. So if you're going to embark on this, let's say an outcome of this project from the community's perspective is an interpretive centre, and that elements of these journeys help to inform the design or the forms, it needs to have both of those threads in there. It's the land and sea spaces, and then the men and women's spaces in both of those realms. Absolutely. But I'll never get to, I can't ask. It's inappropriate for me to ask. And women will never come along on this trip because that's how it is in Fiji. Yeah. Everyone respects that. It's not like someone's being omitted. It's just how it works there.
Of course, thanks for sharing. Along those lines, I wonder if you can talk to the sort of personhood that you have coming in as maybe someone with anonymity in a certain way, where somebody from more of a local culture or local to the area may not have the access that you're afforded, and sort of what doors that opens or closes.
Yeah, that positionality is really important. I think, yes, there's a tendency for someone like me, I experienced this when I was working in the Arctic, that Australian accent, somewhat novel, yeah, and it's entertaining, there's... but Fiji and Australia are not that far apart, and we're connected through rugby and other sorts of sports, yeah, so... but it's really true, I think, that it does give you an opportunity to ask different questions. The student I mentioned before, she's had a lot of trouble doing work back in her village. She's been asking questions and they say to her, that's a stupid question to ask. We raised you in a way that you should know the answer to that. Yeah? She's but it's because I'm the university. She hasn't got quite right. But at the same time, she's trying to do her studies within a Western framework of thinking. Yeah? So I think it does afford some liberties in when you're in that space, but you quickly pick up on things. I think it comes down to the relationships you build early on. The people who bring you in, because it's risky for them too. You know, they're thinking, what does this person want to get out of it? In fact, along this entire journey, I've always been saying we should slow down. Everyone's so excited to show me places, so I can't take it all in. I don't understand how all the families are connected. I can't see how. I know Vuna was one of the big chiefdoms in all of Fiji. How big? You know, I know there's other places called Vuna in different parts of Fiji, and there's a reason for that, is to show that the homeland is, the Vanua is here, there, and everywhere. So I don't understand all the elements of Fijian society yet. I may never. I need to understand the language. These are important tools, you know. If you're working in Indigenous settings, and if you don't have the capacity to do this sort of work, you have to bring people in that you can trust, who will be able to assist. So linguists. So I've taken students across into Vuna, yeah. We were talking before about some of these sorts of experiences. And for me, it's a risk taking students in, because I've invested time getting to know the community, and then they're experiencing what I experienced 5 years ago. And then they're students, you know. But it also helps to build up the relationship, so it becomes, you know, thicker and thicker. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I was curious about how maybe you perceive your way of processing knowledge has changed. It sounds like a lot of it is exercising sort of long-term memory and ways of piecing together knowledge over the long term. And so I was wondering to what degree you rely on the recordings you take and the notes you take, and maybe more sort of traditional Western-based methods of research and information keeping versus maybe a new way of holding all that together.
Yeah. Every time I go to the village, I'm still a student. Yeah. I'll always be a student. So in terms of where I sit in my learning along the way, I went through what you guys, a lot of students in the room, went through, and realised it doesn't fit for what I am working on today in these particular contexts. It was important background training. I wouldn't be here now if I hadn't gone through that, but I think there's other ways. Yes, there's the traditional modes of recording. It's important to do recordings for some of these places where it may only happen there and then and never again. Yeah? People are moving everywhere in Fiji for jobs and other things, so it happens in the moment. So I do rely on that. But there's still a core group in this particular village who I can return to and say, look, I've forgotten about the name, and then they can retrace it like it was yesterday, as if that walk just happened. And one other thing that the chief did after one of my early visits is he renamed one of these cave sites to incorporate my name in that cave. So I think what he was saying here is for everyone in the community to know that that journey was quite important, and that's an imprint in that place, that Scott was here for this purpose to record it, and it goes to show how serious they are about this. I can't give you a set of rules on how you go about doing recordings. It's a personal thing. You don't want to whip out a recorder and video people right there and then. You have to be sensitive to that. But you've got people who are following you in the group, and I often ask, look, can you take the photos? I'm here as the student to learn. So you help people in that regard and build up the knowledge base for you. So it's preserved with many agents in this knowledge system, yeah.
Thank you. How long are usually your trips to Vuna?
To Vuna, not normally more than 3 weeks.
Okay, I know that there's like the 5 like kind of professions or clans that they kind of fall into. Do you like help with any of those when you're there, or is it kind of like they're just hosts and they provide everything for you?
Everything's completely provided. Yep. So, as an outsider coming in, you never cook meals. It's always cooked for you and prepared. The itinerary about what we do for the day is normally negotiated the night before. I might be there for 3 weeks, but it feels like 6 months because the days are so long. The sun's up early, and then we're out looking around, talking, Talanoa, kava, here and there, big lunches, cups of tea, come back. Then the locals bring out the guitars and there's singing, and then you have kava and you map out the next day. So there's this continuum. And at the end of 3 weeks, you're completely wiped. So, and in terms of those various clans, it's called Mathangali. It's not like I'm saying I just want to hang out with the priest clan or I want to hang out with the carpenter clan. And there's no sign up in front of people's places to say who they are. It's only when you get to know the people that it comes out. And you go, oh, I didn't realise you guys were related and so forth. So, again, that is the indigenous landscape in the personnel that ensures that it runs on all these cylinders. But I would say, 3 weeks is about the max for me. And you also have to be careful with your health in places where there's fresh water supplies are hard to come by. So, they're pretty remote places. Remote, if you like. Yeah. So I don't know if there's any more questions, but I just wanted to say a few things about meeting some students here lately. It's been great that there's some really engaged MLA students who have really taken an interest in Indigenous landscapes. Maybe before I was here, but maybe I've helped activate that. And it's been wonderful to mingle with you guys every week the last 3 weeks. So I hope we can keep the conversation going. Yeah, thanks.